Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 16 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, on the second canto. Yes, and we are today continuing on with chapter 6 of the second canto, which is titled Purusha Sukta Confirmed, and we are in the first section from verse 1 to verse 12. Brahma continues describing the universal form, and we are starting with verse 5. But first of all, our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha, patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. All right, so here we go. Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 6, verse 5. The hairs on his body are the cause of all vegetation, particularly of those trees which are required as ingredients for sacrifice. The hairs on his head and face are reservoirs for the clouds, and his nails are the breeding ground of electricity, stones, and iron ores. Wow, that's all a bit striking. Just a very short purport, let me just read it. Prabhupada says, the polished nails of the Lord generate electricity, and the clouds rest on the hairs of his head. One can therefore collect all sorts of necessities of life from the person of the Lord. And therefore the Vedas affirm that everything that is produced is caused by the Lord. The Lord is the supreme cause of all causes. Verse 6. The Lord's arms are the productive fields for the great demigods and other leaders of the living entities who protect the general mass. Okay, so there's a more substantial purport here. Let's have a look. Srila Prabhupada says that this verse is important, and he says it's corroborated by Bhagavad Gita chapter 10, verses 41 and 42. He then quotes the Sanskrit for those verses, which are basically saying, those verses are saying that all wonderful, powerful manifestations are coming from just a spark of my splendor. That's the idea, at least. So anyway, Srila Prabhupada makes the point in the purport, there are so many powerful people and demigods who are protecting affairs in this world, seeing that things go on. Some of them are just ordinary people. Prabhupada lists out a whole lot of different occupations, scholars, scientists, artists, engineers, and a number of others, and then demigods, Brahma, Shiva, Indra, and some others too. So they're all protecting the affairs in this world in one way or another with different degrees of success. And they are all different parts and parcels of the Lord. And he's the Father of all of them, of all living entities, and he places them in different places, higher or lower, according to their desires and aspirations. And some of them have powers by the will of the Lord. Yes, like Lord Brahma, Lord Shiva, they're empowered for different things. Creation in the case of Lord Brahma, destruction of the universe, Lord Shiva, and controlling the modes, passion and ignorance. These are powers. Yes. So, but the bottom line, so to speak, the most basic idea of what is the point here is that we should know, we must know, no one is independently powerful. Yeah. And everyone, even if you have very little power, then you must recognize that whatever power you have, it's his. And it's just on loan. And then whoever it is, and whatever the power it is they have, and whatever duties they have, if they carry everything out in this type of consciousness, then they'll become perfect, actually. Yes. And if not, oh, Krishna, Krishna, it becomes such a hard struggle, it's amazing. Yeah. So therefore everyone has to offer tribute to him, you could say tribute, or just offer their respects and acknowledge the Lord, the part he's playing in our lives. So Srila Prabhupada makes the point that simply by accepting the Lord as the supreme proprietor of everything, since he is actually so, one can achieve the highest perfection of life. So there you go, in a nutshell, that's what it's all about. So yeah, so if people do like this, accepting the Lord as the supreme proprietor, then they'll become peaceful. This, of course, reminds us of Bhagavad Gita, the last verse of chapter 5, the peace formula. We have to accept Krishna in different ways, and one of those ways is that he's the supreme proprietor. Yes, the enjoyer of sacrifice, the friend of all living entities. We have to accept him like that, but really at heart, not just officially or superficially. And then we'll become peaceful. That's what that verse is specifically saying. So these people then, they're empowered by the Lord for service, for his service, not just so they can be powerful and, do whatever they like with the power that he's lent them. Prabhupada gives the example, it's a good example. Just like the children of a rich man are empowered with duties in his business. Yeah. He gives them some responsibilities. Like I would go sometimes, my father had a dry cleaning and dyeing clothes, dyeing business, fairly substantial. And I would go there and work sometimes to earn some pocket money. And he'd put me in charge of some people, something like that. Yeah, and they knew who I was, so they did what I said. They were very nice about it. So I was empowered. Yeah. And in that sort of situation, Prabhupada says, they never go against their father. and therefore they're peaceful and happy within his family, in his service. So we have to do like this, and then there'll be peace and prosperity in human society. Otherwise, like right now, to read the news, I tell you what, it's dangerous. It's just, what would you say? It's frightening. It's frightening what's going on. So to achieve peace and prosperity by somehow sorting things out on the material level, well, it's just simply not possible. So verse 7, thus the forward steps of the Lord are the shelter for the upper, lower, and heavenly planets, as well as for all that we need. His lotus feet serve as protection from all kinds of fear. Well, that's nice. That's really nice. So Prabhupada focuses particularly on the last point, that his lotus feet, the shelter of his lotus feet, serve as protection from all kinds of fear. And it's like that, not just here, but it's like that all over the universe and the upper, lower, and heavenly planetary systems. And Prabhupada, paraphrases or gives an interesting perspective. This sort of dependence is called pure devotional service. And the verse, Prabhupada says, gives an indirect or a direct hint. Yeah, not an indirect hint, but a direct hint. Yes. So therefore we shouldn't try to take help from any of the demigods, because everyone except the Lord himself is dependent on him. So why not just take shelter from him? And Prabhupada says even the super soul is dependent on Krishna, because Krishna is Bhagavan. Verse 8, from the Lord's genitals originate water, semen, generatives, rains, and the procreators. His genitals are the cause of a pleasure that counteracts the distress of begetting. That's an interesting point. I mean, the last point is very interesting. And Prabhupada focuses on that in the purport. Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly extensive purport. So the thing is, family entanglements are very distressing. My parents, they were not poor people. We lived very comfortably. I mean, not like, royalty by any means, but by normal standards, very, very comfortably. And they had 2 sons, me and my brother, and the distress they got from us, gee whiz, the distress they got from us, particularly when we became adults. I became a Hare Krishna. I mean, that was really quite something. That was really something for them. And my brother got into an extremely serious car accident and became a permanent invalid. And he still is. That was 50 years ago, or a little less, like 49 years ago, just after I became a devotee. And the distress and the difficulty, it was just terrible. And so, but Prabhupada makes the point that all that distress which so many parents are going through in different ways, like the President of America. His son has so many problems, of criminality and illegal things he's done. And he's the president, but he's got that. Gosh. Yeah. So all those distresses, Prabhupada says, and of course Lord Brahma says in the verse, they are counteracted by the pleasure of sex life. And if that were not the case, then no one would have children. Yes. So there's a whole arrangement, sort of biological arrangement for providing that pleasure. And therefore you find sometimes some families, they just go on having children. Our not actually next door neighbors, but like about 4 or 5 houses up the road. And they were, anyway, we went to see them occasionally. They had 15 children. Yeah, I remember going there. And it was madness. It was just complete madness. Children killing each other, screaming, demanding, breaking, hitting. It was all these things were going on at the same time. It's one thing if you've got one child or 2 children get into some conflict or something, you can try and sort it out, but when 15 in different ways get into conflicts with different of each other, you need to be a master of negotiations to have a chance. And these people the parents were not masters of negotiation. We saw when we went there. It was just, it was hilarious actually. So yeah, and what to speak of just the interpersonal pressures with children, but children are very expensive to run. Running a car, running 2 cars, 3 cars, it becomes progressively more expensive. So running children, even 1's expensive, but 2, then 3, yeah. So therefore, taking all this into consideration, people who are intelligent, unfortunately there's a shortage of them, but people who are intelligent would understand we should not engage in sex life too much and only for spiritual purposes. So Prabhupada says family planning must be there. And Prabhupada makes a very interesting point. The degraded form of family restriction by use of contraceptives, etc., is the grossest type of material contamination. Yes. So it's really not good at all. So in this way, so many people live for sex pleasure. All right, so on we go to verse 9, which doesn't have a purport. O Narada, the evacuating outlet of the universal form of the Lord is the abode of the controlling deity of death, Mitra. And the evacuating hole and the rectum of the Lord is the place of envy, misfortune, death, hell, etc. Amazing. Verse 10, the back of the Lord is the place for all kinds of frustration and ignorance, as well as for immorality. From his veins flow the great rivers and rivulets, and on his bones are stacked the great mountains. All right, Srila Prabhupada begins the purport by saying, in order to defy the impersonal conception of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, a systematic analysis of the physiological and anatomical constitution of his transcendental body is given here. Yeah. So it's obvious then that the Lord's universal form is distinct from, it's quite different from mundane forms. In this way, we understand he's never a formless void. I mean, it's such a description, it's amazing. So ignorance is his back. So the ignorance of the unintelligent people is part of the universal form. Yeah. So since his body is the complete whole of everything, nobody can assert that he is simply impersonal, only impersonal, nothing else. He's both personal and impersonal. Prabhupada says the personality of Godhead is the original feature of the Lord, and his impersonal emanation is but the reflection of his transcendental body. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? The impersonal emanation, the Brahma Jyoti, is just a reflection of his transcendental body. So anyway, those who see him from the front can see his personal feature, but those who are ignorant see his back, and they are impersonal. Alrighty, so verse 11. The impersonal feature of the Lord is the abode of great oceans, and his belly is the resting place for the materially annihilated living entities. His heart is the abode of the subtle material bodies of living beings. Thus it is known by the intelligent class of men. All right. So in the purport, Srila Prabhupada gets into a calculation of Lord Brahma's life. And, I mean, his life, yeah. And his day, I mean, time is undergone by a Lord Brahma. And then Prabhupada says that generally, a Brahma attains liberation after 100 years of his calculation. And then at that time, the universe, called a Brahmanda, or the round football-like domain controlled by a Brahma, then everyone and everything is annihilated. The Brahmanda, the universe, and the inhabitants of the entire universe, they're all annihilated, everything's annihilated. And then they go into the Lord's, into Mahavishnu's abdomen. Yeah. And where they're in something like a sleeping state. It's called susupti. Elsewhere, Prabhupada talks about it and calls it susupti, which means deep sleep, very deep sleep. So this goes on and on. This just goes on, repeating itself. And the human form, we have the human form of life. It's our opportunity to get out, so we really have to make the most of it and get out. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, in other words, the subtle forms of the living entities take place in the heart of the Supreme Being, and such forms take tangible shape at the time of creation. Wow, interesting, isn't it? So, okay, verse 12, which is the last verse in this section, and it, interestingly enough, it has no purport also. So, all right, verse 12. Also, the consciousness of that great personality is the abode of religious principles, mine, yours, and those of the four bachelors, Sanaka, Sanatana, Sanat Kumar, and Sanandana. That consciousness is also the abode of truth and transcendental knowledge. Wow, that's interesting. The Lord's consciousness is the abode of truth and transcendental knowledge. All right, so now we go into the second section, which is called Purusha Sukta Confirmed. And it's from verse 13 to verse 22. And basically what it's doing, it's drawing parallels between the actual Purusha Sukta, which is a set of prayers from, if I'm not mistaken, the Rig Veda, and how this, which is explaining life on the material level and also on the spiritual level to some degree. The Purusha Sukta. So it's drawing parallels between that and the presentation of Srimad Bhagavatam. So first of all, we'll read through all the verses. First of all, there's verse 13 to verse 16. They're combined together. Beginning from me, Brahma, down to you, that's Narada, and Bhava, Shiva, all the great sages who were born before you, the demigods, the demons, the nagas, the human beings, the birds, the beasts, as well as the reptiles, etc., and all phenomenal manifestations of the universes, namely the planets, stars, asteroids, luminaries, lightning, thunder, and the inhabitants of the different planetary systems, namely the Gandharvas, Apsaras, Yakshas, Rakshas, Bhutaganas, Uragas, Pashus, Pitas, Siddhas, Vidyadharas, Charanas, and all other different varieties of living entities, including the birds, beasts, trees, and everything that be, are all covered by the universal form of the Lord at all times, namely past, present, and future, although he's transcendental to all of them, eternally existing in a form not exceeding 9 inches. All right, so anyway, let's just carry on. Verse 17. The sun illuminates both internally and externally by expanding its radiation. Similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by expanding his universal form, maintains everything in the creation, both internally and externally. Verse 18. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the controller of immortality and fearlessness, and he is transcendental to death and the fruit of actions of the material world. O Narada, O Brahman, it is therefore difficult to measure the glories of the Supreme Person. Verse 19, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is to be known as the supreme reservoir of all material opulences by the 1/4 of his energy in which all the living entities exist. Deathlessness, fearlessness, and freedom from the anxieties of old age and disease exist in the kingdom of God, which is beyond the 3 higher planetary systems and beyond the material coverings. Verse 20, the spiritual world, which consists of 3/4 of the Lord's energy, is situated beyond this material world, and it is especially meant for those who will never be reborn. Others who are attached to family life and do not strictly follow celibacy vows must live within the 3 material worlds. Verse 21. By his energies, the all-pervading personality of Godhead is thus comprehensively the master in the activities of controlling and in devotional service. He is the ultimate master of both nescience and factual knowledge of all situations. Verse 22, which is the last verse in this section. From that personality of Godhead, all the universal globes and the universal form with all material elements, qualities, and senses are generated. Yet he is aloof from such material manifestations like the sun, which is separate from its rays and heat. Okay, so devotees, let's go back. This is the main section dealing with the Purusha Sukta, and therefore why this whole chapter is called Purusha Sukta combined. So, okay, let's have a look at the purport of verses 13 to 16. Prabhupada begins the purport. The Supreme Personality of Godhead, by his partial representation, measuring not more than 9 inches a supersoul, expands by his potential energy in the shape of the universal form, which includes everything manifested in different varieties of organic and inorganic materials. Yeah, so therefore the varieties, Prabhupada says, the varieties within the universe are not different from him, like the gold in the mine is not different from the gold in somebody's ring. So that means, that means a few things, but one of the things it means is that the Lord controls everything. But at the same time, he is a separate, supreme identity. And Prabhupada refers to Bhagavad Gita chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, and he sort of gives a bit of a paraphrase. He gives a bit of a paraphrase. He says, so he is Yogeshwar, everything rests on his potency, but he's different from and transcendental to all these things. This is described in the Purusha Sukta, which this chapter is named after. Yeah. Anyway, that was my paraphrasing. So, okay. So here we go. Now Prabhupada starts talking about the Purusha Sukta of the Rig Veda. It's Rig Veda. And you know, what I could do, in fact, what I will do actually, I mean, one thing I can do, which I will also do, is make the Purusha Sukta available to everyone. At least I have a version of it. I mean, there's a few versions, but I settled on this one. It seemed like a suitable version of the Purusha Sukta. Let's have a look here. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it is, how many verses? It's 16, but yeah, let me just read a few verses so you get the idea, and then I'll make it available so you can just go through it. And we will, as we go through, draw some comparisons here and there between what's stated in these verses and purports and what's stated in the actual Purusha Sukta. So it begins, let me just read the first line of Sanskrit, and I'm sure you'll recognize it. Sahasra Shirsha Purusha, Sahasraksha Sahasrapat. You remember that? You heard that? I've heard it so many times. Okay, I'm not going to go, like I say, I'm going to distribute this. So the translation, I'll translate the first three verses. How's that? Right now, the Purusha, the universal being, means the universal form, has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, and 1,000 feet. 1,000 signifies innumerable, which points to the omnipresence of the universal being, the universal form, in other words. He envelops the world from all sides. That is, he pervades each part of the creation and extends beyond in the 10 directions represented by 10 fingers. Okay, so here's the second verse. The Purusha is indeed all this, the creation, in essence, that which existed in the past and that which will exist in the future. Everything, that is, the whole creation, is woven by the immortal essence of the great Lord, the Purusha, by becoming food of which, in other words, by becoming consumed, in whose immortal essence, through surrender, so by becoming food of which one transcends the gross world and becomes immortal. That's verse 2 and verse 3. The Purusha is greater than all the greatness which can be expressed by words. His one part has become all these visible worlds, and his 3 parts rest in the immortal world of the transcendence. Yeah. Anyway, those are the 3 first verses of Purusha Sukta. Let us carry on and we'll draw some parallels. So the Purusha Sukta, what it does, without using the term Achintya Bheda Bhed Tattva, the Purusha Sukta explains reality in terms of Achintya Bheda Bhed Tattva, that everything's different from and non-different from the Lord. That's Purusha Sukta. And of course it was clarified by Lord Chaitanya, and Srila Jiva Goswami gave the actual term Achintya Bheda Bhed Tattva. So that's what's discussed, the oneness and difference. That's what's discussed, or it's one of the things, or main thing even, that's discussed in the Purusha Sukta. Yeah. So to illustrate the point, I mean, just in terms of oneness and difference as a perspective on life, Prabhupada, as he's done before, gives the example of the gold in the mine and the gold in, he says, the stock gold, or we just read yesterday, the gold in a ring, in a gold ring. It's the same gold. So the gold in the mine, Prabhupada says, is never exhausted, even if so many rings are made from it. So the gold in the mine, therefore, is Purnam. Prabhupada uses the term in the purport there. It's Purnam. And even, Prabhupada says, even if Purnam of course means complete. Hopefully we all know that. Even if Purnam is deducted from the Purnam, still the supreme Purnam remains. How's that? That's, yeah, interesting. Even if the complete is deducted from the complete, still the supreme complete remains. This is transcendental philosophy. So it's inconceivable, of course. Therefore, Lord Chaitanya used the term achintya. Yes, and it's confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, Lord Chaitanya's theory of achintya bheda bhed tattva is the perfect philosophy of the absolute truth. Yes, which, of course, certainly is very, very true. Now, a thing is, Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, in his commentary on Srimad Bhagavatam, he really goes into this whole point about the Purusha Sukta and the parallel, or not just parallel, but as the chapter is titled, Purusha Sukta confirmed. Yes, Bhagavatam is confirming the version of the Rig Veda. Yeah. So, he refers to, let me just read it. Because the Supreme Lord is the possessor of the Maya Shakti, everything in this world is non-different from him. This confirms the meaning of the Purusha Sukta. Like we said, oneness and difference. So this then, Prabhupada says, points to everything being in this world being non-different from him. And this confirms the meaning of the Purusha Sukta. So the line which starts, Sahasra Shersha, we just read it. It's the first line. Yes. And then, if you go deeper into it, verse 12, which starts with Brahmanosya Mukham Asit, verse 12. So the first, the line, Sahasra Shersha Purusha, that whole line, and then the three verses beginning with verse 12 in the Purusha Sukta, they were described in the previous chapter. Now, we didn't point it out at the time, but you can go back and have a look if you want to get into it. Second Canto, Chapter 5, verse 37. Of course, Prabhupada does not get into it in so much detail, but anyway. Then the line Sarvam Purusha Evedam, which is from another verse 16, I think. The Lord is everything in the universe, from the Purusha Sukta, is illustrated in 3.5 verses. Okay, you get it. 3.5 verses here in chapter 6 of the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Yes. So, we don't want to confuse you too much, but in verse 16, we read verses 13 to 16 all together. So in verse 16 of this of this chapter, verse 16, then the words Sarvam Purusha Evedam, verse 16 begins with those verses, with those words. Sarvam Purusha Evedam, which means, it basically means that the Lord is everything in the universe. Yes. So, where are we? So it's illustrated in 3.5 verses. From 2nd Canto, chapter 6, verse 16. So after showing that the Supreme Lord is the cause of the material world, Brahma states that the Lord is beyond the material world and limits the whole world. This world is covered by the Supreme Lord because he exists as greater than this world. He remains, exceeding it by 10 fingers. Anyway, this is a bit esoteric. This is stated to express his superiority to the universe, not to express his dimension, that he's the size of 10 fingers. Since he cannot be measured, being unlimited. This illustrates the Purusha Sukta line, Sabhumim Sarvata Sprishtva Achyatishthad Dasangulam, which is it's all part of Purusha Sukta, verse 1. Touching the earth, he extended himself beyond it by 10 fingers. And the earth means the universe in this context. Anyway, that's a bit complicated, isn't it? That's Vishnu Chakravarti Thakur. That the essence of Purusha Sukta is there in 3.5 verses, beginning with verse 16. So let's carry on, verse 17. The sun illuminates both internally and externally by expanding its radiation. Similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, by expanding his universal form, maintains everything in the creation, both internally and externally. So Prabhupada makes the point, the universal form or the impersonal feature of the Lord, either the universal form or the impersonal feature, the Brahmajyoti, are clearly explained here with the example of the sun's radiation. The sunshine is all over, but the sun planet or the sun god is the basis of the sunshine. So similarly, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is the basis of the impersonal Brahman, which is confirmed in 1427 of Bhagavad Gita, if you know that. Brahmano hi pratisht aham. the Brahman is pratisht aham. Pratisht means established, aham, on me. So the universal form, of course, is imaginary. We already talked about that yesterday. And the ultimate form is Shamsunda with two hands and a flute. And Prabhupada makes the point that, as we mentioned yesterday, and we'll see it mentioned from time to time, that 75% of the radiation of the Lord, of his personal radiation, it includes the entire expansion of the spiritual sky, and 25% is the material universes. Yeah. Just as he says, you know, we referred to 1042 some minutes ago, which says, but what need is there, Arjuna, for all this detailed knowledge? With a single fragment of myself, I pervade and support this entire universe. So 75% is the spiritual world. 25% is the material world, the external energy. We're tatastha. We're at liberty to live in either. But if we live in the spiritual world, we're liberated. If we live in the material world, we're conditioned. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, we can just make an estimate of the number of the residents of the internal expansions in comparison with the number of residents in the external energy. And therefore, we may easily conclude that the liberated souls are far more numerous than the conditioned souls. Okay. So, you know, like we said, the explanation of the Purusha Sukta, the confirmation, just like the repetition of points made in the Purusha Sukta, is going to continue now. Here's verse 18. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is the controller of immortality and fearlessness, and he is transcendental to death and the fruit of actions of the material world. O Narada, O Brahman, it is therefore difficult to measure the glories of the Supreme Person. Right. So, Prabhupada, in order to give us an idea, basically, of the scale of things, the difference between the material world and the spiritual world, Prabhupada refers to the Padma Purana, which says that the planets in the spiritual world are 75% of the internal potency of the Lord, and are far, far greater than those planets in the total amount of material universes. And Prabhupada refers to Chaitanya Charitamrita, giving the example of a bucket of mustard seeds. If one mustard seed falls out, it's not a great loss. And one mustard seed in this context represents one universe. And even in one universe, the number of planets can't be calculated, but in the spiritual world, there's at least 3 times more. Yeah. And each planet in the spiritual world is transcendental, eternal, indestructible, free from all the inebrities of the material world, self-illuminating. Each planet, each one, more dazzling than millions of suns, The inhabitants are all liberated with full knowledge. They have no hankerings and lamentations. And they've got nothing to do except render devotional service. That's it. That's the program. They always, Prabhupada says, they always sing songs from the Sama Veda, and they're all the personification of the 5 Upanishads. 5 particular Upanishads. Prabhupada doesn't, I don't think, mention which 5. No, he doesn't, but 5 special Upanishads. So the Lord is the Lord of immortality, therefore he can give that to the devotees. That's a major difference between the Lord and the mundane lords like the demigods. He can award all qualities of his personality to devotees. And this world is full of fearfulness, but he gives fearlessness to his devotees even in this world. Someone here can become rich by working hard, but they're always fearful of losing their wealth. But in the spiritual world, no one has to endeavor like that for happiness. Happiness is always there. And this is not found in this world, even in Satyaloka. Even Brahma is subject to the laws of fruit of work. So Prabhupada says, it is therefore stated here, Durachya, or in other words, spiritual happiness in the eternal kingdom of God cannot be imagined even by the great brahmacharis or sannyasis who are eligible to be promoted to the planets beyond the region of heaven, means Janaloka, Tapaloka, and even Satyaloka, within the material world. Or the greatness of the Lord cannot be imagined even by great brahmacharis and sannyasis, but the pure devotees, they can get it, they understand it. And Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that this verse explains Purusha Sukta, verse 2 and verse 3. So when you get your copy of Purusha Sukta, you can just refer to these things and see the parallels. And in this way, this part of the Bhagavatam confirms the message of the Purusha Sukta, which, along with Gayatri, Gayatri is the most fundamental verse, the Brahma Gayatri, Om Bhur Bhuva. But along with Gayatri, the Purusha Sukta, it's among the most fundamental of Vedic mantras. Okay, so, verse 19, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is to be known as the supreme reservoir of all material opulences by the 1/4 of his energy in which all the living entities exist. Deathlessness, fearlessness, and freedom from the anxieties of old age and disease exist in the kingdom of God, which is beyond the 3 planetary systems and beyond the material coverings. So, Prabhupada gives interesting explanations in the purport. The Sandhini, out of the total manifestation of the Sandhini energy in this context is the energy of existence. Sometimes we use this word, the term eternal, eternality, but Sandhini also means the sum total of existence. So 1/4 of existence is in the material world, and 3/4 of existence is in the spiritual world. And they're both aspects of the Sandhini potency. Yeah. So anyway, then Prabhupada explains the Lord's energy is divided into three component parts. Sandhini, we just mentioned, means existence. Samvit means consciousness. And Hladini means pleasure. You know, if you want to memorize these, I'll give you a little hint. Samvit is the energy which manifests chit. Chit means knowledge or consciousness. So that's the way I got it. Samvit, chit. Yeah. And, you know, therefore Sandhini, which is the only other one beginning with S. Hladni, we should know, means pleasure. But Sandhini there then means existence. So he is the full manifestation of existence, knowledge, and bliss. And these Sandhini, Samvit, and Hladini, they are the energies which, the manifestations of which in reality, as experiences, are existence, knowledge, and bliss. They're the energies of those phenomena. So in this world, these things are meagerly exhibited, really meagerly. And here, when people are liberated, they can experience them to a small degree, but in the conditioned state, hardly at all. And the pure devotees, a point we can just acknowledge or appreciate at least, is that in the spiritual world, there are so many pure devotees. Everyone's a pure devotee. Far more than all the souls in the material world. And all of them in the spiritual world experience these three energies: existence, deathlessness, fearlessness, freedom from old age, disease, eternity, knowledge, and bliss. So there's a second paragraph, and Prabhupada talks about now that the planetary systems, you remember yesterday we heard about the planetary systems, 14 or 3 divisions. So here Prabhupada talks about them as 3, Swarga, Martya, and Patala. Swarga meaning everything heavenly, Martya meaning everything in the middle area, and Patala meaning everything in the lower section. But it's only 1/4 of the total Sandhini energy, the energy of existence. They're only 1/4 of that energy. But in none of them can we experience, full existence, immortality, full knowledge, and full bliss. The upper planets are called sattvika because they provide facilities for longer durations of life and relative freedom from disease and old age, and to some degree a sense of fearlessness. This is now just on the material platform for people who are on the material platform, not devotees. So great saints and sages get promoted very high in the material world to Mahaloka. But Prabhupada says that also is not the place of complete fearlessness, because at the end of one kalpa, the Mahaloka is annihilated, and the inhabitants have to transport themselves to still higher planets. Here everyone is subject to death, even Mahaloka. So comparatively, they have lifespans, knowledge and bliss, greater, extended beyond those that people in the lower planets have. But still, the real manifestations of these things are only possible beyond the material world. And Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur makes the point. This verse 19 explains verse 3 of the Purusha Sukta, which anyway you'll see as you go through it. It says that the living entities in the material world are 1/4, and in the spiritual world they're 3/4. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.